June 6th, 1944, 6:39 a.m. The base of the cliffs, Pointe du Hoc, Normandy. The morning fog drifted low over the surf, its fingers curling around the jagged stone outcrop that jutted into the sea. The waves smashed against steel hulls as landing craft bobbed like corks, each one packed with men of the 2nd Ranger Battalion. They said little. Salt spray soaked their uniforms. Some clutched rosaries, others just stared ahead at the wall of rock, smoke, and death that loomed before them. Each second in those boats felt longer than an hour. The crash of artillery thundered behind them from battleships offshore, their shells streaking overhead and slamming into the cliff face in preparation for the assault. The sky lit up with the dull red pulse of explosions. It was supposed to soften the defences. But the Germans were still there, waiting. Up above, dug into fortified bunkers, German defenders of the 726th Infantry Regiment watched the water churn. They saw the Rangers coming. But they weren't worried. To them, the cliffs were the best defence imaginable. 100 feet of sheer vertical stone, topped with barbed wire, mines, machine gun nests, and thick concrete casemates. The cliffs had withstood centuries of storms. The Germans believed they could withstand one more. Oberleutnant Bernhard Fröking, commanding the gun crews at Pointe du Hoc, had spent months preparing the site. Camouflage nets, sandbag positions, overlapping fields of fire. He had artillery crews trained to fire in pre-sighted zones. His machine gunners had practiced against moving targets on the beach below. Every man knew his role. Every weapon had its field of fire. He believed his position was impregnable. One American pilot flying cover for the Rangers that morning later said, "It looked like a place no one could live through." Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder stood tall in one of the lead landing craft, his frame broad and composed. A Texan, a former football coach turned combat commander, Rudder was the kind of man other men followed without question. He had drilled his battalion relentlessly, climbing cliffs under fire, rappelling in the rain, practicing demolitions in live fire scenarios. They had rehearsed cliff assaults in southern England until their hands bled. Pointe du Hoc had been labelled a suicide mission. Rudder knew it, his men knew it, but no one said it aloud. Their mission was simple in design, impossible in execution. Scale the cliffs, destroy 6 155mm German artillery guns believed to be mounted above, and hold the position until reinforcements could arrive. The guns, if intact, could decimate Allied forces landing on both Utah and Omaha beaches. Failure wasn't just a tactical loss, it could doom the entire American right flank. The lead boats took heavy fire before even reaching shore. Machine gun bursts stitched the water, sending up geysers around the landing craft. Mortar shells exploded in arcs, some smashing directly into the boats. One ranger described it as trying to storm a fortress by charging through a hailstorm of razors. As the ramps dropped, chaos erupted. German machine guns opened up, MG-42s hammering with terrifying rhythm, firing over 1,200 rounds per minute. Bullets tore through water and flesh. Mortars exploded in sprays of foam, fire, and shrapnel. Men screamed. Some fell before stepping off the ramp. Others disappeared beneath the waves. Those who survived surged forward, low to the sand, dragging ropes and gear, weaving through smoke and death. Sergeant Leonard Lomel, only 23, ran with a grappling rope coiled over his shoulder, sprinting across wet stone. Behind him, Corporal Jack Kuhn laid down suppressive fire with a Browning automatic rifle, aiming at muzzle flashes above. They were soaked, bruised, bleeding, but they moved with urgency. The Rangers fired small rockets attached to grappling hooks toward the cliffs. Some were cut by German fire, others fell short, a few stuck. That was enough. And then, impossibly, the climb began. Wet ropes, muddy boots, bullets from above, rocks giving way, smoke in their eyes. Still they climbed. One ranger later said, "I don't remember climbing, just hands, ropes, pain, and praying the next bullet wasn't mine." From the cliffs, the Germans saw ghost-like shapes emerging from the smoke, scaling ropes, as if gravity didn't apply. 7:10 a.m., the first boots reached the top. Private Charles Parker pulled himself over the edge. He had lost his helmet. His left sleeve was soaked in blood. Without hesitation, he yanked the pin from a grenade and hurled it into a machine gun nest. The explosion rocked the trench. Parker vanished into the haze, firing as he moved. Behind him, more Rangers appeared. They cleared bunkers, swept trenches, and pushed forward through stunned German defenders. One German survivor later wrote, "They came out of the mist. I fired until my barrel smoked. Then one was on top of me, a boy with dirt on his face and a pistol in his hand." Pointe du Hoc, once a fortress, was now a battlefield, and the battle had just begun. To understand why 225 men were ordered to climb a vertical cliff into machine gun fire, you have to go back to the months before D-Day, back to the minds of Allied planners staring at reconnaissance photos, intelligence briefs, hand-drawn maps, and decrypted messages piled high across war room tables from London to Portsmouth. They saw what the Germans had seen. Pointe du Hoc was a dagger of stone jutting into the English Channel. From that rocky outcropping, German guns could sweep across both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. It was the only spot on the entire Normandy coast that offered overlapping fire control of two landing zones. And at its crest sat 6 reinforced concrete casemates, believed to house 155mm artillery guns, long-barreled, capable of striking landing craft from 15 miles away. The Germans had installed range-finding positions and had trained crews to fire rapidly and accurately. These weren't just anti-invasion weapons, they were beach killers. If those guns remained operational on June 6th, thousands of men could be slaughtered in the surf before ever reaching dry land. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, could stall before it began. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 1st U.S. Army, reviewed the intelligence. He understood the stakes. "Neutralize them," he said, "whatever it takes." Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower agreed. The casemates at Pointe du Hoc were more than a threat. They were a potential catastrophe. These guns weren't a footnote, they were a priority. But the intelligence was murky. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed bunkers and trench lines. Resistance sources confirmed construction activity, yet the guns themselves weren't visible. They may have been moved. They may have been camouflaged. Analysts debated. Some believed the Germans had relocated them inland to avoid the naval bombardment. Others insisted they remained hidden in the bunkers. British intelligence offered a mixed picture. Reports from SOE agents conflicted with decrypted messages from ultra-intercepts. Some RAF officers pushed for a preemptive strike from the air, but naval commanders countered that the cliffs shielded the guns too well. Eisenhower had to make a choice based on incomplete information. He chose action. Despite the uncertainty, the threat was too dangerous to ignore. The decision was made: destroy the position, eliminate the threat, even if it meant climbing straight into machine gun fire. The task fell to the U.S. Army's 2nd Ranger Battalion. Not regular infantry, Rangers, men who volunteered for danger, men trained to operate behind enemy lines. They trained in the cliffs and coves of England and Wales. They climbed rope ladders with 80-pound packs, practiced amphibious assaults with live ammunition overhead, and rehearsed cliff scaling, while explosives rocked the water below. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder personally shaped the unit. A former football coach from Texas, he turned them into shock troops, the kind of soldiers who could take punishment and give it back tenfold. Rudder was a strategist and motivator. During training, he marched alongside his men, carried the same weight, and took the same risks. He wasn't just their commander, he was their example. Rangers who stumbled were ordered to climb again. Those who collapsed were carried off and returned the next morning. By the spring of 1944, they were ready. Their training had become legend. British observers watched the Americans climb sheer stone faces under simulated fire and whispered, "They'll never survive the real thing." Rudder heard the doubts and dismissed them. "My boys will take the cliffs," he said, "or they'll die on the beach trying." Their orders were clear. Land at the base of Pointe du Hoc at 6:30 a.m. Scale the 100-foot cliff. Destroy the artillery. Signal success by firing a flare. Then hold until reinforced. Each ranger carried rope, grenades, rifle, pistol, and rations. Some carried thermite to destroy gun mechanisms. Others manned Bangalore torpedoes to clear wire. A few were issued flamethrowers. British intelligence labelled the assault a high-risk raid. American commanders called it a necessary sacrifice. But the Rangers, those 225 men, called it their mission. They knew the risks. A recent war game had simulated the entire assault. Out of 225 participants in the simulation, fewer than 60 reached the top. The exercise was declared a failure. Rudder simply responded, "We'll do better on the day." D-Day depended on paratroopers landing behind enemy lines, on sailors braving mined waters, on infantrymen charging across beaches. But in this narrow pocket of France, D-Day would also depend on a handful of men doing the impossible. They would go in first. They would go in alone, and they would either succeed or die trying. The sea didn't make it easy. The channel was restless that morning, churning beneath a grey sky. Currents stronger than expected pulled the landing craft off course. Instead of landing directly below the German guns, Rudder's men hit the beach several hundred yards east. That error meant more than just extra ground. It meant exposure, running parallel to enemy fire to reach the base of the cliffs. And the Germans were waiting. Lieutenant William Moody, leading a platoon in Company A, later recalled, "The bullets were so thick, it looked like someone skipping stones across the surf. I don't remember giving the order to move. We just ran." The Rangers disembarked into a cacophony of war. Mortar shells exploded near the shoreline. Machine guns opened up, cutting across the water like blades. A landing craft nearby took a direct hit. Men and metal vanished in a single blast. The wounded screamed over the roar of surf and steel. The shoreline was chaos. Incoming rounds tore into the surf and ripped through packs and bodies. One ranger barely made it 5 steps before collapsing. Others dragged the wounded out of the water, only to be pulled back by the undertow. Men hit the sand and crawled. They dragged coils of rope, grappling launchers, demolition kits, Browning automatic rifles and M1 Garand rifles. Some had lost helmets. Some were already bleeding. But they moved. They had trained for this moment. The rockets, meant to carry grappling hooks up the cliffs, misfired in the damp air. Some tangled, some fell short, others worked. A few hooked firmly to roots or jagged edges atop the cliffs. One rocket spun wildly and exploded harmlessly in mid-air. Another missed its target but hit a German sandbag and held. Good enough. The first wave started to climb. Slick ropes, numb fingers, lead flying from above. Ropes swayed, dirt crumbled, shouts echoed against the rock face. Still, they climbed. From above, German troops fired pistols, dropped grenades, even cut at ropes with bayonets. One machine gunner emptied belt after belt into the rising lines until a sniper silenced him with a single shot. But the defenders were stunned. They had not expected anyone to reach the cliffs in such chaos. Private First Class Fritz Nyland, whose story would inspire a Hollywood film decades later, said the climb felt endless. "My hands gave out 3 times, he recalled, "but I didn't stop." "You didn't stop because if you did, someone else would fall." Others reported that the ropes were slick with seawater and blood. Some climbed on their knees, some jammed knives into the rock face for leverage. They climbed with bullets tearing past their ears, sometimes with no idea if they were ascending into open fire. One team's rocket launcher had misfired, but a German explosion had blown debris high enough to form a makeshift handhold. Rangers scrambled onto the stone, clawing and boosting each other upward like ants on a cliff face. Sergeant Leonard Lamel reached the top around 7 a.m. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with blood and grime. Pulling himself over the edge, he drew his Colt .45 pistol and fired into a German trench line. 2 soldiers fell. He didn't wait. He moved. Corporal Kuhn followed seconds later, hurling a grenade toward a sandbag machine gun nest. The blast rocked the shallow trench. Together they pushed forward, clearing the immediate position. Behind them, more men crested the ridge. Private Joseph Radeloff slipped on blood-slick stone and almost fell, until a fellow ranger grabbed his wrist and hauled him up. "You're not dying here," the man growled. "We need grenades." Grappling lines sagged under weight. Some fell, others ascended hand over hand. Smoke from offshore naval bombardment swirled across the ridge. Somewhere to the east, Omaha Beach was already a bloodbath. But here, on this isolated cliff, the impossible was underway. By 7:10 a.m., dozens of Rangers had reached the summit. They moved quickly, fanning out, forming small assault teams. 3-man fire squads, 1 rifleman, 1 grenadier, 1 close-quarters fighter, cleared trenches methodically. They used Bangalore torpedoes to blast through wire, lobbed grenades into dugouts. Some carried shotguns. Others seized German MP-40 submachine guns off the dead. The fighting was brutal, sudden, and unforgiving. One ranger found himself face to face with a German radioman. Both hesitated. The ranger shot first. Another stumbled into a bunker and found it empty, but still warm. Someone had just left. The casemates, massive concrete bunkers that Allied intelligence had feared for months, loomed like monuments to German engineering. Rangers approached them cautiously, only to find most of them silent. There were no guns inside. They searched. They cursed. They double-checked trench maps. The massive artillery pieces that should have dominated the beaches below were missing. Lieutenant Charles Wellborn radioed down to Rudder, who was still coordinating the attack below with a wounded leg. Casemates empty. No visual on artillery. The message chilled the command staff. The guns weren't there, but the danger was far from over. The Rangers stood among bunkers and shattered trenches, staring at a battlefield they had just won, only to realize the true objective still hadn't been found, and time was running out. Confusion rippled through the Ranger ranks. The guns they'd come to destroy weren't in the bunkers. They weren't on the hilltop. They weren't even in view. Rudder, bleeding and directing from a crater-turned command post, knew instantly what it meant. The intelligence was wrong, or the Germans had relocated the guns. Either way, the mission and the threat was not over. The Rangers had trained for cliff assaults, for demolition under fire. They had not trained for ghost guns. But 2 men took the initiative. Sergeant Leonard Lamel and Corporal Jack Kuhn, both from Company D, assembled a small team and moved inland. They had no maps, no guides, just instinct, and the faint clues war leaves behind, tire impressions in soft dirt, bent grass where something heavy had rolled, broken branches, crushed fence lines. Lamel later said, "We had no orders to go. But we had no choice. If those guns were real and still functioning, we had to find them." They moved quickly, cutting inland through thick brush and low hedgerows, rifles ready. The sounds of battle behind them faded into the rustling wind. They were operating deep in enemy territory now, alone, exposed, and invisible to both friend and foe. About 300 yards beyond the cliff line, the Rangers entered an orchard, quiet, abandoned. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil and churned soil. Crushed apples lay beneath tree limbs. An empty field kitchen smouldered, and there, beneath camouflage netting and leafy limbs, They saw them, 5 long-barreled 155mm guns artillery pieces, wheeled and aimed inland, likely toward Utah Beach. No crews, no guards, but the guns were real. Lommel counted them, then checked each breech. Ammunition was stacked nearby in wooden crates. The guns had been repositioned to avoid the naval bombardment, parked behind the main line until it was time to wheel them forward. They weren't decorative. They were functional. And they were loaded. Kuhn set to work immediately. He and Lommel pulled out thermite grenades from their satchels. Each grenade contained iron oxide and aluminum powder that, once ignited, burned at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel. They placed the grenades on the traversing and elevation gears. They stuffed others into the firing mechanisms. One by one, the grenades hissed to life, molten sparks biting into the weapon mounts. The smell of burning metal filled the orchard. To ensure the job was done, Kuhn smashed targeting sights and wheels with his rifle butt. The metal bent and fractured under each blow. A final grenade sizzled atop a crate of shells. Lommel yanked it away at the last second. It ignited safely on the grass. They moved to each gun methodically, repeating the process. One by one, the weapons were neutralized, no longer a threat to Utah Beach, or to the thousands of American soldiers who would soon be pouring ashore. But they weren't alone. Just beyond the tree line, Lommel spotted movement. 2 silhouettes in grey darting between hedgerows. A German patrol. The Rangers froze. They couldn't afford a firefight. It would give away their position. Lommel signaled silence. The Germans passed within 30 feet, oblivious. Only after they vanished did the 2 Rangers exhale. It took less than 15 minutes. But those minutes may have saved thousands of lives. As the last charge burned, Lommel looked back toward the cliffs. Smoke still curled skyward. Somewhere behind that smoke, his battalion was fighting to hold a patch of broken earth they had bled to reach. They began the return march with rifles low and hearts pounding. The route back was worse, branches cracking beneath boots, sweat-blinding eyes. They passed a fallen German courier face down in a ditch. Lommel bent to check for papers. Nothing. Near the perimeter, friendly fire nearly claimed them. A jittery ranger in a shell crater raised his rifle until Kuhn yelled, "Don't shoot!" He lowered his weapon. "You ghosts," he said. "We thought you were gone." Mission accomplished, they rejoined the battered line. They didn't wait for backup. They didn't request permission. They just saw what had to be done, and did it. The guns had been destroyed. The clifftop was secure, but the battle was far from over. As Lommel and Kuhn rejoined the others, they were met not by celebration, but by incoming fire. The Germans were regrouping. Reinforcements from inland garrisons began to arrive. Mortar teams positioned themselves beyond the hedgerows. Snipers moved through the brush, targeting anything that moved. Machine gun nests farther back reopened fire, sweeping across the ridge. The Rangers dug in. They had no time to rest. They used helmets to dig shallow foxholes, flipped destroyed bunkers into cover, and turned craters into defensive positions. They consolidated weapons and ammunition. They stripped gear from the fallen, German and American alike, and redistributed rations, grenades, morphine. Some shared canteens. Others passed cigarettes wordlessly. There was no time for fear. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder refused evacuation. Though bleeding and barely able to walk, he crawled into a shallow bomb crater and set up a command post. His field telephone had taken shrapnel, so he began writing urgent messages by hand on ration box cardboard, dispatching runners across dangerous ground to relay positions and requests for artillery support. Throughout the afternoon and into the night, German forces tested their perimeter. Small skirmish lines probed the cliffs, firing in bursts and then falling back. Mortar shells rained down with increasing frequency. One round struck a group of wounded being treated by the battalion medic, killing several instantly. Still, the Rangers held. Private First Class Jack Pohe remembered, We couldn't dig deep enough. The ground was rock, and every time we moved, someone fired at us. They were down to single-digit rounds. Bloodied hands reloaded weapons slowly. Some men were hallucinating from exhaustion. Others refused morphine, saving it for worse cases. By midnight, they were running low on nearly everything: food, water, ammunition, morphine, hope. Corporal James McQuaid later described it as the longest night of our lives. We couldn't see more than 20 feet, and every shadow might be a German. You didn't sleep. You just waited. At dawn, fog rolled back in, cold, damp, deathly quiet. Then came another assault, a coordinated German push from the east. Grenades rained in, tracer fire cut the sky. The Rangers responded with suppressive fire, grenades and whatever was left. Some fired captured German weapons. Others fixed bayonets and crawled through the underbrush, preparing to meet attackers face to face. They were holding a jagged piece of land barely 400 yards across, surrounded by enemy troops, with no medical evacuation and almost no radio communication. But they held, and as they held, rumours began to spread among the German ranks. The Rangers, some said, were demons. They came from the sea, climbed walls, and never stopped firing. Some German units paused their attacks, not from fear of bullets, but from the belief that they faced something unnatural. From Omaha Beach, the 5th Ranger Battalion and elements of the 29th Infantry Division pushed inland, fighting through hedgerows, barbed wire, and German minefields. Their progress was slow and costly. They encountered stiff resistance, sniper fire, and booby traps hidden in farmhouses. Each step forward was paid for in blood. Finally, by midday on June 8th, 2 full days after the initial assault, they reached Pointe du Hoc. What they found stunned them. The landscape looked like another planet. Craters big enough to swallow trucks, scorched bunkers, bloodied bandages fluttering in the wind, shell casings everywhere, and men, sunburned, soot-covered, many wounded, still holding their rifles, still watching the horizon. A handful had collapsed from dehydration. Some couldn't speak. Others clapped the shoulders of the reinforcements without saying a word. Lieutenant John Bauer of the 29th Division wrote in his diary, "They looked like shadows, like ghosts from a place we weren't meant to see. But they were alive. Somehow they were still there." Of the 225 Rangers who had landed, only 90 were still able to bear arms. The rest had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. But they had done it. The guns were destroyed. The cliff was held. The landing beaches had been spared from devastating artillery fire. The story of Pointe du Hoc spread quickly. General Omar Bradley visited the site and met the survivors. British commanders expressed disbelief at the success of the mission. Military correspondents wrote about the men who climbed cliffs and broke armies. It became legend. 4 decades later, on June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan stood atop the same cliffs. He addressed a crowd of veterans, dignitaries, and world leaders. Behind him stood several survivors of the assault, older now, grey-haired, some in wheelchairs, others leaning on canes, but still Rangers. Reagan's words echoed across the windswept promontory. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc. These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent." The crowd was silent. Some cried. Even hardened press correspondents lowered their cameras. No one spoke afterward. They didn't need to. Pointe du Hoc was more than a mission. It became a symbol of courage, of resolve, of doing the unthinkable, because no one else would. Historians have debated the details ever since. Some have questioned the intelligence failures, the fact that the guns weren't even in the casemates. Others have asked whether such a high-risk mission was worth the cost. Some have examined the tactical benefit. Others have scrutinized the losses. But almost no one questions the legacy, because Pointe du Hoc wasn't about perfect plans. It was about guts. The Rangers didn't know if the ropes would hold. They didn't know if the guns were still there. They didn't even know if they'd survive the first 30 seconds on the beach. But they went anyway. In a war of massed armies and machine warfare, this was something different. This was intimate, personal, human. 225 men launched themselves at a vertical wall of rock under withering fire. They climbed it, fought for it, held it, and changed the course of a day that changed the world. They didn't win with tanks or fleets. They won with ropes, and fire, and willpower. Sergeant Leonard Lamel and Corporal Jack Coon didn't wait for orders when they found the guns. They didn't hold a meeting. They didn't call it in. They acted, on instinct, on training, on trust. They were Rangers, and that's what Rangers do. Years later, Lamel said, "It was the longest day of my life, and the proudest. That pride is carved into the cliffs now, into the rusted steel of destroyed gun barrels, into the scorched concrete of bunkers that failed to stop them. It's remembered not just by historians, but by those who walk the site today. Visitors stand at the edge, looking down the cliffs. They touch the bomb craters. They whisper, because you don't speak loudly in places like this. You reflect. You remember. And you remind yourself that history is shaped not just by generals and plans, but by the people who carry them out when everything goes wrong. The Rangers of Pointe du Hoc did not fight for fame, or medals, or glory. They fought because they were needed, because freedom, like the cliffs, is never truly safe until someone climbs it, and because when the time came, they did, and they left behind more than silence. They left a legacy. Not just in history books or speeches or commemorative plaques, but in the example they set, in the reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep going anyway. When future generations ask what kind of men climbed those cliffs, let the answer be simple. The kind who knew the odds. The kind who saw the guns weren't there and searched anyway. The kind who didn't wait to be told. The kind who stood their ground when no one else could reach them. The kind who defined the word Ranger. Pointe du Hoc was never meant to be survivable, but they did more than survive. They triumphed. Today at Pointe du Hoc, a stone monument stands atop the cliff. It's shaped like a dagger thrust skyward, weathered, stark, unmoving, but what it symbolizes isn't stone, it's sacrifice. Walk among the ruins, and you see the aftermath. Craters like open mouths, bunkers shattered by naval rounds. The silence is different there, heavier, as if time itself pauses. You can almost hear them still. The shout of, "Rangers, lead the way!" The snap of a climbing rope, the thunder of defiance. And for just a moment, if you listen closely, you'll hear the quiet answer of history. They did.